Welcome, everyone. We have a great turnout today and some well-known faces and some that I don't know yet. That's why I'm going to give an ultra quick intro to what this is and then a slightly less quick intro to our guest today. But mainly we want to hear her talk, so I'll try to be brief. Basically, this is part of our outreach for our project, which is called Pushing the Boundaries. It's about agency, evolution, AI, these kind of topics. And what we do here is we invite people that we like or whose work we like, and we talk to them about some interesting topic that's relevant to the project that we have. And we had these discussions for years among us, and then we decided to put them online because they were kind of interesting. So the format is very simple. We will ask our today's guest to introduce her topic, basically, for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then the panel will ask her a bunch of questions. On the full hour, we open the discussion to the whole audience, and then we try to finish more or less on time, 90 minutes from now. Everybody's welcome to either post their questions. So if you don't want to be seen on the recording, just write your questions into the chat. If you want to be seen asking your question during the audience question session, switch on your camera and ask away. We're going to be recording this, so just keep your camera off if you don't want to be on the recording. We also ask you to switch your cameras off during the first part where the panel asks the questions, and then afterwards everybody can switch on. What else? Be civil, talk to the topic, don't attack the person, but the argument, etc., etc., etc. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's guest, and I'm really excited to have Kate. Should I call you Kate or Catherine?
Kate, yeah.
Kate Nave here, who's written a book called The Drive to Survive, which is about the free energy principle, but she's going to introduce that herself. Kate wrote this already, you said 2 years ago, as it's mainly the work that you did doing your PhD, but books take a long time to get published, and it'll be published in March. What is the exact publishing date,
actually,
Kate?
they dropped it unexpectedly early. They published it last week without telling me.
It's out there already. Oh my God, and we had timed this to be before the publishing date.
But I've heard it's out there in the world somewhere.
Fantastic. It's also available on OSF preprint as a preprint if you're interested. And so it is about this topic of the free energy principle and whether or not it explains life and the organization of life. And I'm really excited about this particular topic because we've been busy with very similar questions. And like many people out there, we've been having a really hard time understanding from reading the literature what the free energy principle is actually about. So without further ado, well, I should say, Kate is at the University of Edinburgh, where she did her PhD, and she's now an independent fellow, right? Leverhulme fellow. And that's about it. That's all I wanted to say. And I wanted to hand over to you as quickly as possible. So that's what I'm going to do now. So Kate, welcome, and shoot away at the free energy principle.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I guess the thing I'll say at the start of the discussion is probably one of the reasons that the free energy principle is often so hard to approach is there's lots of different ways into it. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I got interested in it. And then in the discussion, we could maybe look at the various different angles that a person might take on the free energy principle. But I got interested in it because I was initially working on predictive processing and visual phenomenology. And then I read Mind and Life and I got into bioenactivism. And if you're interested in predictive processing and you're interested in biological enactivism, then the free energy principle kind of grabs your attention because at the time it was being described as this principle that could explain the emergence of life, the origin of intentionality and purposiveness, and the claim was that it could do that in kind of bioenactive terms so that it could serve as a formalization of autopoiesis and self-production. So I'll come to that claim in a little bit, but from the perspective of somebody working on cognition, predictive processing the free energy principle often begins by this idea that what we're trying to do as cognitive systems is to learn about the structure of the external world, and the structure of that world is somewhat hidden to us. But for the free energy principle to be able to explain, to be able to tell a story about how we learn about the external world, there needs to be this account of the external world as essentially being composed of a big, vast probabilistic model over a set of possible state of affairs. So if the world is just this vast probability distribution that kind of governs the probabilities and conditional probabilities of various possible states of affairs, and then we think of the cognitive system as trying to infer that probability distribution. And one of the kind of key ideas in the free energy principle is if you think of that inferential process as a process of Bayesian inference, then you can kind of reduce the dynamics of that inferential process in a particular way. So you can take the idea that this particular system is a cognitive system and it's inferring the external world, which is a probabilistic model. Then if this system is representing that external world, then it must be representing that certain states are more likely than others. And then that gets understood as the idea that we can look at the dynamics of an inferring system and see, does it tend to occupy certain states more frequently than others? So if you have any sort of dynamical system that it converges towards a small set of states and tends to remain there, then you could look at that as a system that is moving towards more likely states. And then on this idea that that system is an inferential system, then you treat those most likely states as representations of the most likely states of the world outside. And then whenever there's a deviation from the state that the system is most frequently in, that gets described as a prediction error, moving to an unlikely state or a surprising state. And that gets described as being minimized when the system returns to the state that it's most frequently in. That's kind of just the very sort of basic minimal core of this idea, that there's a sort of dynamics of inference that reduces to returning to the most likely states, the most probable states, that is as though you are inferring those most likely states. And if you think that the kind of purpose of a cognitive system is to infer, then it looks like you're describing those purposive dynamics as being returned to the most likely states, changed to return to the most likely states whenever you get pulled away from them. And there's tons of issues that you would have with that. Firstly, it seems almost tautologist, but that is tautologist to say that any system should return to its most likely state. The other is that just because you have a system that is reliably returning to a particular set of states, your cognitive system, and another system that is reliably returning to another set of states, your external world, the fact that their dynamics are covariant is a very weak criterion for describing one as trying to represent the other. But a bigger issue that kind of grabbed me there is that it rests on this idea, if we're trying to represent the external world, and we're trying to do that by inferring a probabilistic model, that only works if you think of the external world as being the kind of stable thing that can actually be described by a stable probabilistic model. So it needs to be a statistically stable sort of system. It can vary in all sorts of ways, but its statistical properties would have to remain stable over time so that we could, converge upon them. And that works all right for things like, pendulums or planets that are going through a repeating set of states over and over and again over time. But it's not very good if you're trying to model something like a dispersing herd of cats, right? They have no average position that you can converge upon. Their average position is constantly changing as they're spreading out and running all over the place. So there's no stable probability distribution for you to learn there. And a lot of the world is like that. It's things that are decaying and expanding, not just cycling through the same sort of small subset of states over and over again. So one of the key ideas in this kind of broader framework, what kind of gets called the sort of active inference component of the free energy principle, is that instead of thinking of the cognizer as the cognitive system as trying to converge on a probabilistic model that is already stable, we can think of it as acting upon the world to make it stable. So that's a system that when it's trying to learn about the average position of a bunch of cats, it's picking them up and putting them back in the same place. So it's putting them in the same place that it's predicting they'll be in, and by that activity of picking the cats back and herding them into the same place, it's creating a stable statistical system that it can then similarly like converge upon a representation of. So it's not the matching to a system that already has stable statistics, but it's the convergence between two coupled systems to a stable statistical sort of behavior. So that's kind of, for me, the sort of the best way of getting at the core of what this account is trying to say. And if you kind of accept that, you know, you can go quite far with it. You can describe all sorts of sort of coupled systems that have a stable dynamic between them in terms of inference and action and perception, and that can be quite a useful way of modeling with them, and I have no sort of objection to modeling those kinds of systems. But the kind of initial worry you have there is, why think that cognition is about preserving statistical stability? It seems like the whole reason we want our system to be statistically stable is so we can describe it with this probabilistic model. But that's just a limitation of the particularly restrictive representational framework that we've chosen. Why would we force the world to be like that? And that's where the free energy principle then hooks in to these kind of enactivist ideas about mind-life continuity, because that idea of maintaining statistical stability gets tied up with this idea that we can define survival, define biological survival as the maintenance of stability. And if we think cognition is about life and continuing to and keeping yourself alive, then if we can define that in terms of stability, that seems like a nice sort of bridge between basic biological processes and these kind of cognitive ones. And there's like some plausibility to the idea of thinking of survival as being about the maintenance of stability, right? Like the most obvious example is just homeostatic processes, where we try and control our body to maintain a stable body temperature. And so in the free energy literature at the kind of time that I was writing about this, there was lots of declarations about the idea that all this stuff that gets talked about in enactivism, about living systems being autopoietic systems and self-producers, that all that really amounted to was just this idea of control and stability, like a homeostasis of organization. And if that were the case, then it seems like the free energy principle could give us a way of formalizing that in terms of the maintenance of a stable probabilistic model. So it would formalize biological purposiveness, and it would provide a bridge for scaling it up to accounts of cognition in terms of predictive processing, where you're trying to maintain stable probabilistic models over multiple different timescales. Okay, so that's kind of I think, the motivating package. And that did appeal to me at one point, but as I looked into it more and more, one of the main things that I realized was this conflation of survival and stability was this key idea kind of prior to the development of ideas about autopoiesis and enactivism, and with the kind of cyberneticists of the 40s and 50s. And a particular figure who's really central in that is William Roche Ashby, who was very, very, I think, explicit in what he was doing in trying to reduce survival to stability over time. And his whole goal was to eliminate all these metaphysical concepts of purpose and teleology, and also to eliminate the idea that there is any difference in kind between living and non-living systems. Because everything that exists over time, on his kind of view, must be stable over that time period. Every sort of physical system maintains itself in a particular, is maintained or maintains itself in a particular subset of states. And it's just that living systems are much more complicated in their stability. There's no difference in kind between an organism and a machine. And Ashby was probably the cyberneticist who took that view to its sort of most extreme statement of a kind of eliminativist view of purpose. And that's a bit confusing, right? Because earlier we saw the free energy principle presenting this homeostatic control as something exceptional to life. But then in Ashby, we see that it's already been realized that mere stability over time and returning to your most likely state when you're disrupted is a very trivial property. And increasingly, the free energy principle has come to see it that way as well. It's no longer presented as a theory of the emergence of purposeful systems, but more a theory of everything that doesn't draw a clear line between life and non-life. And so I was very disappointed by that, because if you went looking for this kind of inactive explanation of how living systems are this kind of transition that brings meaning and purpose and intentionality into the world, but what you ended up with was this very austere cybernetic reduction, then it seems like maybe what the free energy principle had done was undermined the enactive project by showing these features of biological systems to be just trivial, that we were mistaken to think that there was anything exceptional about what living systems do. So I think I'm nearly done. I would just say that the main thing I took away from that then was that it reveals the importance of the differences between the kind of account of survival that you find in Ashby and that you find in, say, Thompson and Varela as they developed the concept of autopoiesis. Then distinctions that are washed over when this sort of autopoiesis or self-production is just treated as essentially homeostatic control. And just two of the distinctions that are key in the book is firstly the idea that autopoietic systems don't just maintain a stable state when disrupted. They're inherently metabolic systems, which means they're these kind of unstable systems that have to actively regenerate themselves through material turnover. So they're not the kind of system that if you leave them alone, they'll just be stable and all they have to do is react to disruptions to return to the stable state. They're the kind of systems that have to continually seek out matter and energy in order to rebuild themselves. And there's a lovely paper by the philosopher Johannes Jaeger talking about the kind of early cybernetic accounts of purposiveness, where he kind of raises this point about the meaning of metabolism and suggests that it gives this kind of intrinsic need to this sort of metabolic system, precisely because it has that sort of continual need to reach out and rebuild itself independently of whether or not there's any sort of external threat or disruption knocking it around. And that's very different from these kind of homeostatic systems. And there was this very nice kind of caricaturization of them by Gray Walter, another cyberneticist, where he described Ashby's sort of control systems as just these sleeping machines that were just trying to return to rest whenever they were disrupted, but didn't do anything else. So that gives the idea that there's more to life than stability. But even though I said stability was trivial for most inanimate objects, there's kind of a weird sort of flip side to that, where I don't think it is trivial for living systems, because in addition to stability over time not being sufficient for something to be a living system, or to be a purposive system, I don't think it's even a necessary principle that we can expect of living systems, because you expect a system to be stable over time if what defines a system is some set of invariant features. So like this pencil has, you know, a certain shape, a certain color. If I melted it down, it's no longer that pencil. It's defined by, let's say, a set of particular properties. But that's only true of what we might think of like on a sort of substance ontology, where things are defined by invariant properties that they have to have over time. And that doesn't work very well for organisms. So obviously many living systems, you know, contingently happen to have stable traits over some timescales. So my eye color and my hair color are kind of the same as they've always been. But that's not the same as those traits being necessary features that define me. If I dye my hair, I don't become, unfortunately, you know, an entirely new person. Fortunately, I also don't cease to exist just because some properties of myself have changed. And I think when you look at the sort of life cycle of living systems, or the life process of living systems, you realize that it's not just complicated systems like ourselves, complicated humans who are liable to undergo these kind of sort of midlife crises. We can find them all across living systems, and they can involve really fundamental changes that are much more core than hair color. Now, sometimes it's been argued that those can just be explained as predictable variations within a larger stable model. And we can discuss whether that's a good strategy. I don't think it works. And one example that I think is really nice for that is cases of like lateral or horizontal gene transfer, where you can transfer genetic material gets transferred across species, and that can give an entirely new metabolic capacity to an individual of that species that's never had that before. So there's no sense in which, say, metabolizing a particular compound is something that that individual has ever done, or something that any other individual of that species has ever done before. But when it takes in that particular piece of genetic material through horizontal gene transfer, it suddenly has an entirely new behavioral repertoire that's a complete sort of unprostatable, as Kaufman sort of talks about it, violation of any kind of stable model that we would have had of that individual. But we can still recognize it as the same individual system continuing to live in a completely different way. So I think when you can combine these ideas, the importance of continual metabolic turnover and the possibility of these kind of unprestatable changes, you're led to a more sort of processual view of organisms, where their survival isn't about the preservation of any kind of invariant trait. And that means any model that attempts to sort of fix a particular invariant that system will always have to preserve over time is only going to ever be a best guess. It's never going to give us a definition of what that system actually must do, or what purposes are driving it in continuing to survive. So those are the kind of like two limitations that I focus on in the book that come out of the FEP. And I guess what I'm doing now is I'm interested in exploring what kind of accounts can we give for living systems that take that sort of stuff into account. And I guess that's all I had to say.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. And I just wanted to say again, I mean, I really, really enjoyed reading the book, and it just brings out so many ways in which an approach can obscure the crucial questions. And you said one thing was this confusion of homeostasis and biological organization, which is crucial, right? So I also find that a big drawback of the sort of the Paris San Sebastian school, that they always have these diagrams of how the organization looks like, and they're static. But this is not a static organization. It needs to change, actually, to stay the same. And so the only invariant character of a living system is the fact that it remains, it keeps its self-organizing, its self-manufacturing organization, right? But to do that, it has to change all the time. And so this is beautiful. And I was very frustrated with the FEP when it turns out to be not a processual view. I thought it was a processual view of nature, but it's not. So I have 2 questions for you. I have 100 questions for you, but there are other panel members and an audience here, so I will keep myself restrained. I have a very general question for you, and then a bit technical, specific one. The general one is I just keep wondering. So one thing that characterizes the literature about the FEP, and you've also touched on this now in your presentation, and you definitely talk about it in the book, is the shifting goalposts. So the theory is presented as a theory of cognitive representation. Then it's becoming a theory of life. Then when that is refuted, now they're revolutionizing physics, is what Maxwell tells me. So is there anything in the end, now that you've studied the FEP so thoroughly, that you think, you've shown a lot of things it doesn't do in the book. Is there anything that it actually does?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the things that it doesn't do are the things that I personally find the most interesting. So that's what I've ended up focusing on. But that's because I'm not somebody who's trying to model brain dynamics. I'm somebody who's like curious about, and as a modeling framework, the active inference sort of tool set, as far as I can see, seems to be very useful. And I like this. What I like about, I said I began with predictive processing, and I like the predictive processing account of cognitive function. I think a lot of it's quite useful. I think it can tell a good story about how our capabilities for action and control get sort of scaled up to something a bit more substantial. I don't think there's like any kind of good story there yet as to how you get to the full sort of cognitive suite that humans have. But there's a nice potential story there. I mean, one of the reasons I like that story is it's not a new one. This idea that these kind of control loops can become scaled up to sort of higher order predictions and more complex cognition, that also kind of developed out of early cybernetic work. So there's Powers, the control of perception, goes slightly in that direction. And Susan Hurley has some really nice sort of stories about how sensory motor loops scale up to higher order cognitive capabilities that I think are quite compelling. She's got this paper called the shared circuits hypothesis, which actually goes through these steps. So I'm a bit torn, because when anyone asks me that question, I'm like, yeah, I think there's a lot of value in predictive processing. And then I start to talk about it, and I'm like, but the value that I think is there is also in these older papers. But that's fine. That always happens, right? So it's not to say that I don't think that there's not a useful connecting up from like this kind of life to mind scaling up problem story that these accounts can help us with. I think there is. I think, when people criticize the kind of bioenactor account a lot of the objections are with this scaling up problem. How do we get from the basic biological purposiveness to higher, more complex forms of cognition? And I get more frustrated because I think the basic account still isn't properly understood or defined, and the kind of conflation between homeostasis and autopoiesis is a perfect example of that. And often when I talk about it, I say, this is a distinctive property of living systems, and people will say, oh, but machines can regulate themselves. And it's like, no, but it's not just regulation. So that's what I focus on. It's not to say that this doesn't have useful applications elsewhere. I just don't think it's useful at that level.
Yeah, that's a very old battle of mine. Autopoiesis is not just feedback, and you can just put that on repeat and nobody ever gets it. That's a real problem. So I also think that there is something there, but I still haven't quite been able to put my finger on it. And just a little follow-up to that first question, and then I have the more specific question. The sort of newest claim in the community is that it's just a model, a sort of a very radical instrumentalism. I call it the I don't have any philosophy. And I hate it because it's not that you don't have philosophy. It's just your particular philosophy to claim that this is just a model. What do you make of that? Is that solving any of the problems? This is really not even addressing the problems that arise from the interpretation of the principle, which is, if you have a principle, one of its most important conceptual functions is to be interpreted in useful ways. Is that, or am I getting the point, missing the point there somehow?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a model thing. So one of this maybe seems like a tangent, but I think it connects. One of the things that sometimes people often say is, well, obviously living systems do have some features that are stable over time. And insofar as they have those stabilities, we can describe those. So it's still a good model of the fact that things tend to have the stabilities that we need to model. And it's like, sure, you can describe some properties. The question is, are you describing the right ones? Like, what we're interested in is not these contingent stabilities. We're interested in whether those stabilities are important for what makes the system a living system over time or not. So the fact that it's kind of descriptively adequate in certain cases, if you're kind of at least, what's the word? Post hoc, if at least going backwards, you can pick out those stabilities and say that they were stable over time. That kind of move to descriptive adequacy seems to me that you should want more than that. And sometimes it kind of comes up with I think the point I tried to make in the book as well that I think is kind of important is there's a difference between this idea that all models are wrong, all models are simplifications, and some models actually being quite fundamental distortions. So yes, as a model, it's a simplification, all models are simplifications, but there is a sense in which this is a much better model of non-living systems than it is of living systems. And that's kind of, I think, just saying everything we model is going to be distorted and simplified can sometimes kind of lead you away from focusing on what is the nature of that distortion. Is that distortion actually really important? Is it leading us to miss what we should be caring about? And I think that is what happens with it's just a model of living systems kind of approach.
Yeah, it's just sort of a little bit disconnected. And I think so one thing that really characterizes living systems, and you repeat that in your book several times, is that they behave in unexpected ways, this unprestability that Stuart likes to say. And this is not captured. But then, so when I talked to Maxwell Ramstead about your book, then he said, oh, but it's only about the steady state approach, the FEP. There is another one which is over the trajectories themselves. So you have to sample the trajectories of a system. So this is my technical question. That suffers from exactly the same problem, because if a system does unexpected things in the future, you cannot just sample past trajectories and then claim that you predict the future behavior of that system, because that what characterizes the system, what makes it different from non-living systems in particular, is that it behaves in ways that are fundamentally unpredictable through, as you keep saying in the book, closure of constraints, biological organization. So do you have, you focus on the steady state formulation of the FEP, is my criticism of the trajectory-based sampling approach correct? Is my impression correct, or what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah.
Either you need to be able to describe those trajectories in advance, which I don't think you can do,
No.
or it's a post hoc redescription. And I think often it's presented as a post hoc redescription. So you say, for any sort of path that the system takes, you can describe it as minimizing the total amount of surprisal or unlikeliness integrated over that path. And I think that's connected to these kind of ideas of like least action principles in physics and stuff. But the thing that's being minimized, it's a functional, but it's a function of quantities that are relevant, have an interpretation outside of that context. Whereas if you're just defining surprisal by what is minimized over the path, then it's defined entirely within the context that makes it true that it's minimized. So it's completely trivial. I found that quite frustrating, actually. Like, I think there is a real difference between, we have some quantities that we've measured elsewhere, and we can see that they have a particular mathematical relationship over all kind of trajectories that physical systems take, versus we can define a quantity in terms of its being minimized over this trajectory. So that's one way in which you can make it true that surprisal will always be minimized over a trajectory, but it's meaningless. The nice thing about the steady state thing is at least it is making a claim, right? It's defining surprisal in a way that is not just, doesn't have to just be post hoc. It has to be, if this is the set of states you've been in most frequently previously, it has to be that same set of states going forward. So it is at least making an empirical claim. It just turns out to not be true of living systems.
Fantastic. I've said more than I should already. So panel, who wants to go next?
Then I'll just jump in. And I'd love to kind of pivot a bit to the closure of constraint concept that you also use a lot. And basically what I'm interested in, because I've now been reading up more on that, is you offer that in some sense as a solution to many of the problems that the free energy principle poses. And it provides a different solution to, I think, also different questions partly. But I'd be curious as to where do you see are the main limitations of the closure of constraint principle? Like if we go and use that, and also because previously, just before the discussion, you talked about that you're now working with people in AI. Maybe I don't know if you've talked with them about this. If you stretch it kind of towards this direction, if you talk with them about this, is it helpful, not helpful, and where do you see the main limitations?
Yeah, so in terms of the AI thing, what I would say is I haven't really had many conversations with the kind of people who would disagree with me. So in terms of the ability to use this framework to like get at a real distinction between a living organization and a sort of a computational machine, I don't know how effective that'll be yet. We'll see. The limitations of it. I think one thing I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around a bit is how exactly to connect the closure of constraints up to this idea of unprestatable change. Like the nice thing I think about this kind of constraint closure story is it seems to kind of be at this like sweet spot in between a process type story and a organization type story, because it's not all just processes. It's not all just like a cycle of processes. There is a kind of structure that is constraining energy to enable processes to happen. But if you tell that kind of the wrong way, it sounds like it has to be that same structure that is regenerated over time. And that's a criticism people sometimes make of it. Like, how do you, if the constraints have to channel energy into rebuilding those same constraints, how do you get a transformation in the organization? That's something I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to explain and connect up. It's not that it hasn't been written about, it's just not something that I've fully got my head around personally yet. And I think that is a slight difficulty. But the main strength of it is just, I think, the focus that it brings back to like actual flows of energy, that you need not just dynamics within a fixed structure, but a structure that channels energy into rebuilding that same structure. And I think that kind of energetic aspect, that thermodynamic aspect of self-production has not always been, it's not always been focused on enough, hence the idea of autopoiesis as homeostasis. Or if it is focused on, it's at the level of a single cell. So you know, at the level of metabolism, the idea that it is an actual rebuilding process is very clear, but how do you generalize cell metabolism to other scales? And something like constraint is really nice for that kind of, you know, it can be a catalyst, but it could potentially be something at a very different scale from a catalyst in an individual cell.
Right. I mean, if you haven't looked at it, I think a work a body of work that goes into many of those directions is Terence Deacon's work. And his, because he also works a lot with the notion of constraint. But the other question that you touched upon now that I'd be interested to pose to you is, I think you've, in some sense, two different types of scaling problems. It doesn't matter if you take closure of constraints or free energy principle, whatever. You have like you can approximate or like things work to some extent if you look at very small scales, but then either if you go up to stuff like consciousness or if you go up to ecosystems, I think it often gets very complex. I think in one the consciousness problem is you have layers of novel emerging phenomena, and with ecosystems you of course get those questions then basically now how far is the closure of constraint? Is this ecosystem as a whole constrained or not? I'd be curious to hear your take on that, and where closure of constraints and how closure of constraints comes in handy for that, and or if you see that the free energy principle also comes in handy somewhere in dealing with those questions, because it does provide a very concrete mechanism in some sense.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things that came out of the free energy literature discussion was this idea of sort of multi-scale strategies in terms of how we think about life. And you can have the same sort of story with the closure of constraint story. So I think what I want is something that is less promiscuous than the kind of purely processual view of life that someone like Dupre has, where you can carve individuals up in lots of different ways. Something that's a little bit more like there is a fact of the matter about what counts as one biological individual versus another, but one biological individual can also be part of a larger biological individual, like an ecosystem, like potentially an ecosystem that could also be a bigger constraint closed system. And what's nice about this kind of account, I think, is it allows you to sort of say, you know, one bird is not part of the same individual as another bird. They are distinct constraint closed organizations, but they are together part of a larger organization. That's a kind of modeling, it's a move that happens in the free energy principle as well. It's just that I think the constraint closure story is much better at getting at what the boundaries of individuals are than the free energy principle story, because the way in which boundaries are described there is very, very permissive, and it's not clear to me that this kind of story that they tell is very good at getting at biological boundaries.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, who's next?
Yeah, maybe from my side, so a short, maybe twofold follow-up to some things that were mentioned already. So first of all, term-wise, you use a lot the homeostasis, but also the sort of sweet spot you just mentioned, and I think I never read the term heterostasis in your book. Just wondering if you thought about this a little bit as well, or if there are other reasons why you haven't used it. And another one would be more the formal side and formalization of things. So you also read a lot about the impossibility of reduction to physics, but how is it then about formalizing it in general? So is it just about physics, or do we need another sort of language that we can use then to formalize or find other mathematical structures? If you have any clue what that could be, what to use there. I mean, we work a lot ever more with category theory or stuff like that. Try to formalize these different levels of organization that you also kind of describe in your work, and also emergence, finding ways to maybe finding a language for emergence, and yeah, to fulfill this other conceptual side of the FEP.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know what a better formal language for this kind of thing is. I'd love to to know what one would be. People have spoken to me about category theory a lot. I don't have an opinion on it as a kind. I know it's what Rosen kind of used category theory a bit, but I don't yet have a strong view on what the kind of, on whether it does what I would want it to do. What do I got to say about that? Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, to be honest, I'm at a position where I know what kind of formal framework isn't doing the work that I would want it to do. I don't. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I don't think I have a strong idea on what the right formal framework would be. I quite like a particular thing I've been kind of following up on recently is there's a lovely kind of account by like Leo Buss and Walter Fontana. They have this old paper called The Barrier of Objects from Dynamical Systems to Bounded Organizations. And it's talking about precisely the limitations of something like a dynamical systems theory account of life and the idea that you need this kind of compositional structure. And it's funny because it's going back to much more like sort of standard computationalist sort of formalisms, which is not what I expected. But I'm kind of seeing the argument that they have more to say potentially about creativity type processes where like you're constructing new kind of possibility spaces. But it's new to me, so I don't have much more to say than that.
Can I just jump in for 1 second because this is just burning under my fingernails because I'm trying to write a paper with Yanni Hofmeier about the problem of embodiment and the problem of formalization. So I think that what we're hitting here are really limits of what can be formalized. And the reason for this is that in order to understand the dynamics of an autopoietic system, you need to understand that the processes co-construct each other as they go along. So they don't, like what you said before, right? What you pointed out so clearly, that it's not feedback, but it's a co-construction. And this, from Rosen's work, you can take the tools that show how this is what Hofmeier calls collectively impredicative. So it's actually a mathematical explanation of what Stuart Kaufman means by unprestatable. So it will do things that are not capturable in any formal model that is finite. And so so this is a very interesting sort of avenue that we're trying to go. But I think the question is, it's sort of a reframing is necessary here, not to what formalism we need, but what are the limits of all the formalisms we have, and what can we learn from looking at those limitations?
Yeah, I think a thing that's come up for me is really interesting in this is we can't formalize this stuff, but we can think about it. So it's interesting that we can think about these systems as existing and understand how they change over time, even though we don't have the formalizations for it. I don't have much to say beyond that, but I think it's something interesting about our ability to cognize stuff beyond formalization. I think maybe because I'm not a mathematician, I get a bit frustrated by, like, formalizations are really cool and really beautiful, but sometimes there are things that you can't say in a formalization that are worth saying. And sometimes people say, but it should be formalized. And I'm like, maybe it can't be, but it's still interesting and important. But yeah.
Or it can be like the world of the complete totality of mathematics and logic, which can be formalized, but not completely. So that's another another option there. Okay, sorry, Kevin, for interrupting.
No worries. Some more questions are already arising here. I wonder if Andrea wants to ask one before.
Yes, and Andrea, it's your turn, and then we'll open up the discussion.
But first of all, thank you very much for this interesting, ideas you put in your book. So I'm coming a little bit from a different direction. So I'm mostly interested in models and modeling practice. So, and one thing I'm, at the moment I'm particularly interested is in how models from physics get into biology. So what our scientists are doing to the model, with the model, or what they are not doing, or if they are forcing the biological systems to become or to fit into the models which they know well from physics. And I think there is this kind of, you force your biological systems into something, in your formal apparatus or tools and models you have to make it work. So example is renormalization, group theory, and talking about universalities, and you have phase transitions, all these kind of things, and you observe them in genetic networks, for example. So when you cut out a network, a genetic network, and you forgot the rest of the biological system, and you talk about agency, which I really like, your notion about agency. So where you say that it, an agent is something which gives a law to itself. So this kind of co-constructing and organization and processual, what's going into the biological system and makes it so much different. So they just leave it aside. So when I was reading about the free energy principle, I was asking myself, so what, you mentioned a couple of, ways of how the free energy principle is in predictive processing or in this inactive notion or approach, how it enters the modeling. So, and not familiar too much with this free energy principle and the discussion. So it would be interesting. So free energy principles comes, for me, it sounds it comes from physics, identifying stable states, and you have trajectories into stable states. So I'm just wondering if something similar is going on here. And, and if you see any way of how to bridge this, coming from physics and getting into biology. And I think you made a couple of points where I thought you see a way of make this free energy principle work in biology, or it could have some useful or could become a useful tool.
Yeah, in terms of the kind of forcing the biology to fit the physics, or forcing our conceptions of living systems to fit the kind of models we've got from physics, I think that's exactly what's gone on. There's a really nice example of this. There's a paper where I think it's with I don't know his first name, and Friston, where they say a phase transition amounts to a death. So basically, we can model anything that's not a phase transition, and that's fine because phase transitions are deaths, so we don't have to worry about them. It's like a very explicit forcing of something to fit your model. In terms of the utility, I think it's just that, the idea that these are just models. I was being a bit snippy about it before, but I'm sympathetic to the idea that as models, they can be good models of some things that biological systems sometimes do. But there's no sort of guarantee that they'll be good models of everything. Biological systems always do. And there are certain kind of, I think basically any sort of biological behavior that is well captured by the idea of controlling states over time is probably going to be quite well described by this sort of story. But that, I think, is a much smaller subset of what goes on in biology than this kind of framework is typically allowed for. So it's exactly a case of taking the phenomena in the sort of range of all the stuff that living systems do, focusing on some of it and saying, look, we can describe this really well, and extrapolate that out to everything else that goes on in biology. But yeah, the phase transitions equal a death is the most beautifully clear example of doing that I've seen.
Yeah, no, I agree, but it's somehow I find it very curious, how hard physicists are trying to get their models working into biology, where you obviously see there's a difference. So there is a limitation, there's a boundary on how it works. And from our work, what we see a little bit is that when you take a closer look and not only looking at these official narrative about free energy principle and what can it do, and it's all about life, and all these kind of things, and look what scientists are really doing with the models. There's much more going on because you are confronted with data, with all observations and stuff. So I think maybe it might be richer, and it might be, getting to limits, and maybe there is some kind of element where it can be really productive also in this terms that, maybe become more critical, or change it, or you, as you say, maybe for some areas it works, or for some parts of the biological systems it works, and for others it doesn't.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we have tons of hands up. I think we should slowly open up. The audience is burning to ask you questions, Kate. So we'll open up the discussion a bit before the hour already. And so I think there is a question in the chat that, first of all, got a heart from someone and is sort of very on the topic. So I'm going to go and jump the queue and go with that first. So B. Hilbert, do you want to read the question yourself, or should I read it for you?
I can read it.
Yep.
So it's what constitutes a system to be actively self-organizing, i.e. being an agent, as compared to an active, passively self-organizing system, or what makes an organism organize? Yeah, so I think that the key thing for me that came out of this is that, so there's a nice example in one of Ashby's papers where he talks about the concept of self-organization, and he says there's two things we could mean by that. We could mean, how does the unorganized become organized, or how does an organization become better? How does an organization become more organized? And then dismisses the first question and says all we care about is organization becoming better organized, and then tells that story in terms of a system that can adjust to become better at stabilizing itself. Whereas I think the first question is a super interesting question, which is, how does unorganized stuff become organized? This is why I like Ashby so much, because he so explicitly says all the things that annoys me. Like all of the stuff where I disagree with someone, I just like, and I do think a lot of that way of thinking is the same sort of line of thinking that's happening in the free energy principle. But that's a bit of a tangent. So the difference for me between a actively self-organizing system and a passively self-organizing one is that passively self-organizing ones are systems that return to a kind of a naturally stable state. So they're in an energy well, and you could disrupt them from that, you energetically disrupt them from that state, and they go back to it. So they're locally stable. Whereas living systems are not locally stable, they are inherently unstable and continually sort of balanced. That I like to think of it, if you think of most physical objects are at the bottom of a well, living systems are balanced on the top of a very narrow peak, and they have to keep moving to stay up there. So that's the kind of difference for me between active and inactive, and I think that's really important, because it's very easy to say this system is actively doing something and this system is only passively doing it, without really explaining what that distinction is based in. And you see it a lot when people talk about, human cognizers do things intentionally. So we intentionally, construct an identity, or we intentionally do all of this stuff. And animal cognitive systems maybe look very clever, but they're only doing that passively. So one of the things I really wanted to get out of a story of biological purposiveness was a way of making that active-passive distinction more robust. And I do think a core part of it is, are you a system that is sort of spontaneously active inherently because of the way you are physically made up? You are physically unstable, and that's constantly driving you out into the world to get the energy and matter you need to rebuild yourself? Or are you a system that's kind of inherently locally stable, and any movement that you make is only in a response to being disrupted from that locally stable state? So that's kind of how I think about the active-passive distinction. There's much more than that to get a story of what makes something an agent, but that's, to me, like the key thread that is needed in any account of active agency.
Yeah, thank you very much. So basically, active maintenance is putting physical work into being yourself, and being a rock doesn't involve that. It's just you're being a rock, right? Yeah. Okay, so Andrea Gambarotto, you had your hand up for light years, basically.
Hi, Yogi. Hi, Kate. Thanks. It was a nice, very nice presentation. And also for me, like many others here, I was kind of like coming from a more biological autonomy and active background. And I was at the beginning interested in the free energy principle. And I think your book was the final nail in the coffin that made me decide that I'm just not going to bother. But there were others nails. And one of those were a few events that we had when I was in San Sebastian, because as Yogi was saying, everybody is trying to understand what the heck the free energy principle is about, and so were the people in San Sebastian. So they organized a couple of events, and one of those was Ines Ippolito was coming, and she's also a very interesting work because she's really in the middle between the free energy principle and the enactive approach, and she was presenting a lot of the stuff. And my question, a lot of the stuff was essentially stuff that you can find in any book or paper by Ivan Thompson or Ezequiel Di Paolo, or you name it. And so I was asking, so what's the point of the free energy? Why do we need the free energy principle at all? And the answer she was giving was, yeah, of course, I'm not only interested in providing just a processual philosophy of biological nature. I'm interested in also providing modeling tools, and I think the free energy principle provides the modeling tool, and that was enough for me at that point. But then we had another workshop with Thomas van Es and Miguel Aguilera, who's a mathematician, and especially Miguel was saying he was trying to explain to us poor philosopher the mathematics behind that. And essentially, he was using mostly dynamical system modeling. And so the main takeaway that I took from that seminar was, of course, if you have a very, very simplified system with very, very few couplings, then maybe the free energy principle as a modeling tool is doing a good job and trying to explain what's going on. But as soon as you start getting more couplings, as the situation you normally get in a living system in the wild, the equation explode essentially. Mm-hmm. So essentially, it's a very good modeling tool, but only for very, very simple systems. So what's the point essentially? And so I just wanted to know whether you have any thought on that. And I was also curious to know what, since now you seem, if I understood the book correctly, you dropped the free energy principle. I was kind of curious to know where you're going next. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Yeah, in terms of the modeling thing, I guess I tend to just say I leave that to the question of how useful it is as a modeler to the people who are building the models. And I know lots of people who find it very useful to build models of brain dynamics. It's whether or not it's a good model of a biological system. I think it's going to be very limited for the reasons you've just said. But perhaps if you're focusing on the right kind of behavior that's encapsulated in precisely the right sort of way, then it can be a good approximation. It's not something I guess I have a particularly strong, like once I've been clear about what I think the limitations are in general, whether or not it'll work in particular cases isn't something I necessarily have a strong position on really, particularly because my issue with it is essentially, can you describe a system in terms of can you define a system in terms of a stable dynamical system? I don't think you can for a lot of things, but maybe contingently they will be stable over the kind of situations and timescales you're interested in, and if they are, that's enough to describe them in this way. Though, as you said, there's other issues beyond just the instability, in terms of like the complexity of the various connections and whether you get the kind of Markov blanket organization you want. Yeah, I think that's maybe a position for some of the people you've been talking to who have a more technical take on that than I would. In terms of what I'm doing now, there's two things. One of the things is trying to use this point about the distinction between autopoiesis as being about metabolism, as being about like construction, not just stability, to engage with some of the literature that's trying to ascribe goals. Sorry, I've got a bit of cough. Some of the literature that's trying to ascribe goals to artificial intelligences, which often draws on this very kind of cybernetic notion of purposiveness, where it's about control, it's about stability over time. I think a fun thing that I think I'm trying to do there is to show why that's kind of self-undermining, even independently of the desire to have purposes be unique to living systems versus non-living systems. Any kind of dispositional account of goals, I think, is going to fail because we don't have a good way of defining the dispositions of a system. So it kind of ties into some quite nice kind of Kripkensteinian issues around whether or not you can say that is what the system is reliably disposed to do. So that's kind of one of the things I'm working on at the moment, and trying to argue that something like a self-construction account is therefore like a better way to is a better approach for trying to identify what sort of systems do have goals of their own, as opposed to goals that we're projecting onto them.
Okay, so that is my current struggle, and I've just submitted an abstract for writing a paper on this. The point that people don't get is that if you're not self-constructing, you have no self, you have no experience, there is no there is nothing of value or relevance to you, and no matter how complicated your LLM gets, it will never ever I can tell you that. So people always tell me, why are you so sure about this? It's in the constraints of the architecture that it will never be able to get any agency at all as long as you're in an algorithmic framework. Mm-hmm. And I just don't understand why it's so hard for people to understand that. And we had a question from David in the chat that was about preferences, but I guess, so David, is that satisfying your question, or or preferences are kind of like goals, I guess? And you also had a very good comment in the chat. So David wrote, the free energy principle is an approximate model of systems that do approximate modeling. I like that. So if we've covered that question, then Matteo would be next.
It's an honor to be here. Pleasure. I'm not in that field. I'm just like going on a tangent here. Please give me some rope. So if we model stuff with like a least surprise kind of idea, then so that would mean that biological ideal would be like to have a probability calculation where the sum, or like if you integrate it all, would be 1, right? And so in theory, that could then create a fixed point of some kind of dimensional reaction to certain outside functions that a biological system experiences, right? And so I've always thought of these things like as a hierarchical assemblance of fixed points that interact, are like chained to each other, right? So if you give a certain input to a system, that so kind of having that checksum game that biology plays. I hope I'm kind of getting to a point there. Does this maybe ring a bell, or stimulate some thoughts?
So would the idea be that the kind of behaviors that look like they're not reducible to stability around a particular point, they emerge from multiple different stabilizing systems?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm just leaving it.
So it's like the fixed point itself becomes like an oscillating string, mm-hmm. Which can be discretized to certain actions, right? But you've got always this kind of black swan problem that the expectation is that I integrated over the entire thing and it is 1 as a probability. But if I introduce like a shock moment, so which comes outside the system itself, right, that fixed point collapses. And therefore you have got this kind of autopoietic system that has to rebalance itself because it suddenly has to integrate 1 additional peak that wasn't there, right? And that changes the entire frequency of the oscillation of the entire system. Does that maybe make sense?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with like the particular kind of, I guess, model you're talking about. It sounds interesting. What would I say? I was going to say something, I forgot what it was going to be. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I come up against with this sometimes, or like I feel like I need to clarify, and maybe this relates to this, is that I think it's plausible that almost inevitable that there will be general models you could have of how a living system in general has to, the kind of balances it needs to maintain. So any living system needs to maintain a certain balance of like energy input and output. For that to be a first principle of an individual living system, it would need to be not just this is what living systems in general have to do, but this particular living system has to do this specific thing, so that we can identify invariant features that are not just definitive of life in general, but definitive of an individual living system. The idea that we can identify features that are definitive of life in general that are going to govern this kind of rebalancing process, I think is plausible. But how a particular individual system will rebalance itself and how that's different from any other living system, that's the thing that I think we can't identify like a sort of fixed sort of model for in advance. But I'm not sure if that relates to what you're talking about or not. So let me know if it doesn't.
I mean, it kind of does. So, like, what I'm trying to get to is that, of course, that simplification in itself, it's like the Schrödinger equation, right? Like, you have to simulate the entire thing to actually get the full intricacies of everything, right?
Okay.
So I don't think it's any more collapsible, because the emergentism generates through like the interactions between those different like predictive models, like these like in other word would be like a substrate of like an area of stability, right? And I found it interesting that you before said that there's this kind of probability peak of living systems. But I'd rather say that it's more like an adaptation valley as well, right? Because like the more advanced the system gets, the more like the higher echelons of choices and predictability, that like if they break down and they're no longer usable, then you would go down to a lower level of thinking or existence, right? So I think it's more like it's really hard to say that yes, the chances of a certain high level existences are low, but you need to have this entire like substructure beneath it that allows lower level existence to take over at almost any instance, right? Like you can take a human out of society and he will instantly learn how to adapt in the wild pretty easily, just from base intuitions, right? Does that somewhat make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe one of the things you said were in terms of you have to know, you can know about the stable behavior of the system but you have to know everything.
Yes.
I think that definitely ties into one of the sort of issues that I was talking about, where when I was talking about the unprestatability of living systems, I didn't actually want to go into the debate around inherent indeterminacy because I just didn't have the time in this book. So what I was saying there was that one of the things that makes living systems different is not so much necessarily that they are, though I think they probably are, that they depend on these indeterminate events, but that they are kind of open to these kind of, they're much more open to unexpected disruption from elsewhere. Whereas any kind of physical object that's not living, because we define what that system is, it's precisely because we define what that system is, we can sort of define out these additional shocks, because we say, I'm interested in what the system does so long as it remains a pendulum, and I can predict anything it will do so long as it remains a pendulum, and anything that is outside of that prediction, it doesn't matter because it's no longer a pendulum, so I don't need to worry about it. Whereas with the living system, precisely because we don't get to define what it does, that means we can't define away these unexpected events because we can't know that they'll destroy the system. So it's a different point from the inherent indeterminacy thing and more about the openness to unpredictable shocks thing. That means you would have to know everything to know what a living system would do. And that's precisely, I think, that's precisely how I at least make this distinction in the book. And I think that is what you're talking about.
It reminds me of this discussion, we have to move on, but it reminds me of this discussion about Turing machines that you can make non-deterministic and you can make interactive, so they can interact with other Turing machines. And then, of course, the stopping criterion no longer applies, so you can't tell if it holds in any case. But the point is that neither the non-determinism nor the interaction helps to solve the problem. The organism still doesn't behave like an interactive, non-deterministic Turing machine, still not. And also, the kinds of algorithms that can run on such machines are still the same that run on a normal Turing machine, except they have different runtimes, and you don't care whether they terminate or not.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't address the actual problem of the functioning of the organism, which is qualitatively different from any sort of computation.
Mm-hmm.
In a weird way that we try to get our finger on here. But we need to move on because we have 3 or 4 more questions that we want to get through. So thanks a lot for this question, Matteo. And I think the next one with a hand up was Bartosz.
Right. Thank you very much for your talk. As one of my predecessors in this discussion said, your book also felt like a final nail in the coffin for me for the FEP, mainly because I think you were the first one to formulate a lot of novel and very valid points of criticism. And yeah, at this point, that could be my first question. What do you think the future would be of the FEP? Do you think there's going to be some schism approaching? And on that question, could one of these, let's say, breakaway strands of research, could it be some sort of inactive FEP? And on top of that inactive FEP, as soon as early as in 2005, Di Paolo, coming from enactivism, made an argument that autopoiesis itself is not sufficient for sense-making and naturalizing sense-making. He said, well, we also need adaptivity. Then Thompson in 2010 said, yeah, right, that makes sense. Let's also take adaptivity on board. 2013, Villalobos said that, this adaptivity actually looks a bit cybernetic.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2018, Kirchhoff and his collaborators, they started putting out these papers saying like, oh, this adaptivity thing already implies notions like control, self-monitoring. Why don't we just take it and express it in terms of the free energy principle and active inference? Why not? So my question would be, do you think that this strand of research maybe has some future? Not because the FEP is very inactivist, but maybe because enactivism is not as radical as it is portrayed to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I would say that my issue that I've been focusing on is the idea that you can't make sense of adaptivity without autopoiesis. But also that autopoiesis is, I agree, is not enough. Particularly because that's like, as I think, is it Nathaniel Virgo has a paper where he says, it's this either or norm. It's like, don't do that, but it doesn't tell you what you should do. And that you need some sort of story about, okay, so I shouldn't die, but what does that tell me? That leaves a lot open. I think one of the things is like, I like this idea that a lot of adaptivity isn't rational. It is just, given I shouldn't die and I can do all of these things, I'll do this one, but there isn't actually like a story about why this rather than that. It is very contingent, and that contingent process then constrains you in future. But in terms of some forms of adaptivity where, you do need to there are kind of recurring events that you need to regulate and respond to, I'm relatively sympathetic to the idea that a story like this could be useful for that. And I think there's a nice kind of attempt to bring this together. So Leonardo Bick has a paper, Organizational Teleology 2.0, where he's like taking these kind of control story accounts and saying on their own they're not enough, but autopoiesis, also needs control. So yeah, I as I said, I kind of like predictive processing as a story in a lot of ways, and I think for some aspects of how we control, how we adapt, and the really interesting is how do we anticipatorily adapt? How do we model what's going to happen to us in future and adapt to that in advance? I think that like a predictive processing kind of story is actually quite useful for that. So I'm quite open to that being. Yeah, I get, sometimes it sounds like I'm just like a critic, but I'm a critic specifically of ignoring autopoiesis or watering it down. The extent to which that connects up with a control type story in certain situations, I'm quite open to, and I'm open to. I think maybe what I'm like less convinced by is that necessarily the free energy principle is the best way to tell that story, because it is such a messy framework in ways that it just doesn't need to be as messy as it is. And it brings in things it doesn't need to bring in. But like very smart people use it and do cool stuff with it. So even if the framework is like bloated in ways that it doesn't need to be, I think you're almost certainly going to get good stories about adaptivity framed in those terms, just because that's what people have chosen to use. So I like the stuff that Petzulo does with the free energy principle, and his kind of like hierarchical affordance competition type stories connects quite nicely with the sort of stuff that Susan Hurley was proposing that I was talking about earlier. So I'm quite open to those sorts of stories. But yeah, in terms of which direction the free energy principle is going, it looks like I'm going to need to read your new paper, because I hadn't seen that. That looks really cool.
Great,
Thank you.
fantastic. The question is, when will we get the first FEP self-help book? How to minimize surprise. So we have two more questions. Alessandro is first, and then Moritz.
Hi. Sorry. I've just put you guys sideways. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So yeah, my question, hello everyone. I know I'm on the call, and yeah, very nice to meet new people. My question had to do with the talk on purpose that has been sort of circulating, and this kind of comes from a nice discussion group that sort of occurred last year, which was a conference on purpose. It's called On Purpose. And I kind of wanted to ask about the intrinsic versus extrinsic purpose distinction, and to what extent that can help us here, and whether the closure of constraints is considered an intrinsic purpose account, which from what I understand has to sort of leave behind these historical, I think, processual based explanations. So I guess I'll start there, and I guess I'm sort of more motivated by what you all brought up in terms of the inability to formalize, yet ability for us to talk about this. So I'm thinking that maybe it's this, we have this, this intrinsic purpose. I mean, we definitely do. We know what we're talking about. So we're maybe casting that, to these, we're using that as doing some of the work that then when we do formalism, we just sort of, assume that that's there, which is kind of, this is the mistake that's sort of occurring. But yeah, I wanted to ask about the distinction and what your thoughts are.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. So the reason intrinsic purpose is something that matters to me so much is precisely because I think a lot of modeling activity, a lot of science involves it involves abstraction, and that involves kind of this. Whenever we're kind of modeling a system, we focus on certain things over others, and we say, you have all these philosophical debates about which is the correct thing to focus on. And I'm a pragmatist, so I think it comes down to, I think there's always a pragmatic story to tell there. But then what bothers me is then people sort of take those purposes for granted, or they either appeal to evolution, they say, the reason we focus on these things rather than others, the reason that this is a better model is pragmatic, and pragmatic reasons have evolved out of our evolutionary history. And I find that quite unsatisfying. So the hope is that if you have a better account of, this is like maybe this connects much more to the bigger, broader philosophical project. But if you can have an account of intrinsic purposiveness, then you can have account of things being useful or functional relative to individuals or groups, but where we can actually say something meaningful about what it is for something to be good or bad relative to a group. And that is very appealing as a sort of a middle position between this kind of, no one wants to be like an all and out subjectivist about truth and reality, but nobody wants, well, people do, but this idea that like what is the correct model or the correct description as being something independent of us is just not very workable either. Whereas if we can have an account of a robust account of intrinsic purposiveness, I think that gives us like a way to put this kind of pragmatist view of science on a stronger footing, and not just a pragmatist view of science, but like a pragmatist view of all sorts of issues. And that's the thing that I'm sort of trying to get to grips with and connect up with at the moment, is the debate in terms of constructivism in ethics, where you try and make an account of what is like moral norms in terms of as being something that is constructed, but where that constructive process is not like a free-for-all. It's not like you can just construct anything. There are sort of procedural norms on how you can construct a self, and those procedural norms govern what kind of norm, those procedural norms govern like what kind of construction is viable. But it's not, so it gives you a way, I think, of getting purposes to be not independent of us. Not, McDowell has this lovely phrase, constructed in like splendid isolation. They matter to us. They are something that is about us, but they're not up to us. And that's the real thing that I want to get out of this, out of intrinsic purposiveness, which maybe takes it a bit far away from like questions of scientific modeling, but it's all the same thing.
Yeah, no,
question.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's really pertinent in this conversation still, because where these sort of obscured distinctions come out tends to be in this very cognitive approach, cognitivist, framework that we've been using in computational framework. But when you start asking questions about affect and relevance, as other people on this call are interested in, you just can't get away from it. And then AI affect, can they have consciousness? Like, then you're asking, well, this good or bad for the individual is really what matters. But yeah, I'd love to talk more, and I'll pass it on.
Yeah, we should. It's a nice kind of self-undermining of that project as it tries to build into areas where it just can't work. Yeah.
It's sort of a constructivist realism about norms, which is not a joke, because it's, the construction of the values is real.
Yeah.
I really like that. Yeah.
There's a really
the
nice
book that won the Lakatosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're really talking about perspectival, okay.
No, I was actually going to say a book that I think has just been so helpful for me in this kind of thing is a book by a woman called Celeste Ng about Hegel's concept of life, and it's basically saying that all of this is in Hegel, which is like maybe not what you want, maybe not what I want to hear anyway. But it's such a rich development of precisely this kind of project, and showing that that's kind of what's going on in the science of logic. And it's not a view that I'd ever come across before. So it was a very kind of, I don't know, it's very clarificatory to see what the constructivist project in ethics is doing as having slightly missed the idea that construction isn't about human intellect, it's about biological process. And I think this insight that construction isn't just a human intellectual process, it's a real biological process, is precisely what gets you that realism in your constructivism. But yeah.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have the last question, and it's very pertinent that he's getting the last word, Moritz, because Moritz should have been on the panel. He's the PhD student in the group who actually works on the free energy principle. So, Moritz.
Hey Kate, nice to see you again. Like,
Hey.
we met like, I don't know, 5 years ago at
Yeah,
the
it's
cabin
a while.
workshop with Johannes, you remember? And it was funny because you already like told me the beginnings of this argument. So it's super cool to read the book now. I just want to congratulate you on that. So since I have the last question and we don't have much time left, I'm gonna keep it very short. We talked a lot about like the problems that the free energy principle has when we try to like make it fit to enactivism. And I think a lot of the discussion from the book and that we have now, I completely agree, and was very interesting. I'm just wondering a little bit, like what is the solution that we can get from enactivism to like, okay, maybe we cannot formalize it, but I was thinking of like the neurophenomenology program that was like, I don't know, proposed 25 years ago. And it didn't seem to convince, like, at least cognitive scientists too much to change the way they do science. So what's your take on what can we actually take away from like this enactivist and free energy principle debate? What does enactivism do that helps us, change the way we study the mind-life continuity?
Yeah, so what it does for me is what it should do, and I think maybe what it hasn't been seen as doing enough, is it's often been seen as just a way of getting rid of representations. That like, look, we can model things in terms of dynamical systems instead of in terms of symbolic processes that represent the external world. And I think one of the reasons that hasn't been very compelling is that's not really, well, I don't know. it's an alternative way of modeling what is essentially the same thing. Whereas the main issue for me is how can we judge these different abstractions? What makes one a better abstraction or a worse abstraction? And if you have an account of this kind of basic normativity, then that's at least one way of saying the best abstraction, the best model is the one that captures what the system is really trying to do, not just what it happens to be doing. Getting that distinction between what it's really trying to do and what it happens to be doing, which comes up all the time, when you're talking about, is this a signal or is it just noise? All these debates in cognitive in kind of trying to sort of parcel up the mechanisms of the brain, which components are relevant, is it spike timing, is it rates? All of these debates are all about which parts are relevant and which parts aren't. And I think a lot of the problem is a lot of the time they're not being approached as in that way. They're being seen as, look, I've shown that this thing happens. I can describe that phenomenon in this way, and I can describe it in this way, and those models are kind of interchangeable, and the question becomes which is more useful for me as a scientist, which is simpler, which is easier to work with. Whereas if you have a story about, okay, but we can actually identify a question about what the system should be doing that doesn't depend on some evolutionary history that we don't really know and could be a just so story, but what it needs to keep itself alive, then that at least gives you a way to decide gives you one way of deciding between different models. It's the way that I think is the best way of deciding between, are we really getting a good description of the phenomena? Obviously other people will have different ways that they care about. But I do think a lot of debates around, is this the best way of describing a particular pattern of behavior or a particular mechanism for a particular pattern of behavior do get a bit kind of stuck in a circle, because people just have different things that they are interested in. And insofar as they're interested in different things, they're going to model it differently. But if they want to actually have a story about, is this a good cycle? Is this a good internally consistent way of talking about that behavior? Or is this one better? Then the idea of this kind of intrinsic purposiveness of the system that we are in fact modeling gives us one way of doing that, that's only available in the case of systems that do have intrinsic purposes. But that's a very philosopher's answer of why I think it's useful. It's not a good story about why it's useful to a cognitive scientist necessarily, unless they, I think it would be. But it's not a story about enactivism offering a better way of modeling cognition. That's what the dynamical systems kind of side of enactivism, I guess, wants to do. I'm more interested in a better sort of way of thinking, how do we decide, are we actually getting at the process that is genuinely cognitive and genuinely purposive or not? And as I said a couple of times, I'm sympathetic to the idea that something like predictive processing or the free energy principle could be a really nice, more predictive processing could be a really nice way at getting at a bit more of a reconciliation between what cognitive scientists have wanted to describe in the brain and how inactively inclined people have wanted to describe the brain. So I think that genuinely can be useful. I'm just interested in this other underlying question, I guess. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that answers your question. It's getting on a bit and I've maybe not followed.
No, there's a lot of interesting points there. I completely agree. And I can also see just discussing, making clear what the philosophical foundations are, that they're really in tension. The tension between the philosophy of free energy principle, whichever you want to choose, and enactivism, whichever you want to choose, is an interesting question in itself. But I'm kind of wondering what, since you mentioned predictive processing specifically, what does this add to the scientific debate? I'm just thinking of this Anil Seth and who was it, Jacob Hoey paper of predictive processing as a tool to study consciousness. Sounds great, but it also didn't implement anything. Maybe I'm too pragmatic here for this discussion, but I'm looking for this push that breaks the bubble and convinces scientists to use these ways of thinking.
Yeah, maybe I'm more skeptical about the fact that there's anything like that will just change everyone's mind. I mean, in terms of an account of consciousness, I don't know. I'm not really convinced that there's any particularly good frameworks for talking about consciousness. But I do think what predictive processing can give is a nice story of content, because I'm not anti the idea that what we're doing is we are contentful systems, and that we can anticipate the future and coordinate our activity with respect to that. And as a story of how you can ground content in biological processes, then something like predictive processing seems to me that it could be a good story there, that is actually like, there is a model that you can work with. It's not just like a vague analogy, you can actually sort of tell a story about how this stuff gets scaled up in more mechanical detail. And that should be useful and has been useful in various cases. Whether everyone's going to kind of change their minds about how they do these things, I guess that's just a sort of socio-historical thing that will not happen over time. But yeah, I think at least I do, I mentioned Giovanni Pezzullo's work on this kind of affordance competition, and with Paul Sisek on this kind of affordance competition story, which I haven't really checked in on what's been going on with that more recently, but I think that's one really nice development that is appealing from an enactivist kind of type perspective, that still gets you to a more cognitivist kind of, cognitive model of what's actually going on that might be useful. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what happens when the dust settles.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for the discussion.
Great, fantastic. So we're just as much over time as we started late, so that should be okay. I hope we haven't kept you too long. This was a fantastic discussion and a really great book, Kate. Thanks a lot. Great crowd that turned up, so thanks for all your questions. And I just wanted to say, the future of the FEP remains open because it's done by people, so it's unprestatable. So we'll see what happens next. But it's a bit ironic that it doesn't seem to be in a stable state as a field itself, so it couldn't describe itself. We will have Kate also as a participant at the workshop we're doing in July. So for those who will be at that, we'll have plenty more time for discussion. And we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's lots more to say, but your book is not just very clearly written, accessible. It's also saving me from reading a lot of these primary papers that you cite. I am really, really thankful for that, because I'm going to skip some of those. And I think we have to give the FEP that it is an intriguing approach. It's not just nonsense, but it is really hard to get a grip on what it's actually doing. And it is also a fact when you read the literature that the proponents of the FEP don't really do an effort to make it easier for anyone to understand it, which is, I suspect, part of their mystique of, if you don't understand their work, you're not smart enough, which I find really unhelpful in terms of discussion. Yeah, so that's it from our side. Thanks a lot for your time, Kate. And thanks for writing the book. And it's already out, so I wanted to say now it's going to come out and you should buy it. But so go buy it.
You can get the free open access copy.
Oh,
you don't have to pay
you're
for it.
bad at marketing, but you're also not making any profits from the book.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks a lot.
Right. Thanks, everyone. That was great.